Let me ask this question. When scientific evidence appears to contradict something that you believe the Bible teaches, you've been clear that you think you can have the way that evolution has explained some parts of the creation and Genesis 1 and 2, but take something like the resurrection. Let's say that some evidence came out that really just made it look like, this would be more historical than scientific, but that really made it look like that the resurrection didn't happen, or something in science directly contradicted the Bible. How would you approach that as one of the world's finest scientists?
Well, I think God gave us two books to try to understand truth, and I do believe that there is such a thing as truth, and one of those books is the Bible, and when I read the Bible, I'm always trying to understand exactly what is the meaning in the context of what kind of literature is it, who was the audience it was written for, was it in fact a record of an eyewitness or some other kind of description of events. And I think that is something called hermeneutics, which experts in biblical interpretation have been struggling with for as long as we've had a Bible to read. And reasonable people will sometimes disagree about exactly what the meaning is of a particular chapter or a verse. Science can make mistakes too. Science, though, is self-correcting. Science has its principles, and there are certain aspects of observation which over the course of time are so consistent that they become in the category of deducted truth that one can generally be pretty confident is not going to change at some future time. When there's a contradiction, or there appears to be, then I think we've made some mistake, because I don't think truth can contradict truth. When I read the descriptions of Jesus' life on this earth and the crucifixion and the resurrection, those read to me in a very compelling way as a description of real events, not some mythical description. And of course, there's lots of evidence outside of the Bible for the actual reality of Jesus' life. Read N.T. Wright's massive tome, The Resurrection of the Son of God, and you can see all of that laid out in a historical, scholarly way, and it's extremely compelling. So I have a hard time imagining a scientific result that could contradict that, because that seems to me to be absolutely rock solid. That is the cornerstone of my belief and of my faith. When it comes to Genesis 1 and 2, there's so many different arguments about what that description of creation is all about, that Augustine, writing 1600 years ago, warned us not to attach ourselves too closely to one interpretation, because new evidence might come along to prove that wrong. And in fact, that's exactly the place we find ourselves in right now, and I wish those warnings were maybe listened to a little more carefully.
Right. All right, so you're talking, let's say, to a UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University student who's sitting in, many of our students sit in psychology classes, New Testament classes, some science classes, where they're a sophomore in college, and a man or woman that is extremely educated and very persuasive lays out for them a case on why God, specifically the Christian God, could not possibly exist using some historical or psychological. And unfortunately, they don't have Francis Collins or even somebody, much less on the scale like myself beside them to say there's a different way of looking at that. What counsel would you give to a student who finds themselves bombarded with evidence that looks like they don't know how to deal with it right then? How do they hold on to their faith in that?
Well, I think they need to tap into other resources that are available to help with those circumstances, and a lot of those are written into books. I mentioned N.T. Wright as a historical scholar whose, I think, interpretation of the Bible is, to my view, extremely rigorous, not sort of set up with a presupposed conclusion, and I would put N.T. Wright up against Bart Ehrman's any day as far as trying to understand what is really true. I think in this faith and science issue, there's plenty of books out there now that would help a student who's wrestling with whether there's a conflict here to begin to see that there are in fact ways to bring these things together that are entirely harmonious and that add to your awe of God and not subtract from it. My own book tried to do that. Darrell Falk's book called Coming to Peace with Science is a wonderful book which reaches out, I think, particularly to evangelical students who are wrestling with how to accept evolution in a way that helps them see that this is in fact completely compatible with God's creative genius. Other books more recently out, Carl Giberson's book called Saving Darwin, it goes through many of these same arguments in a very compelling way. Owen Gingerich's book called God's Universe, from the perspective of a distinguished Harvard cosmologist, also making the case that all of these aspects of scientific observation and God as the creator fit together quite nicely, and in fact make a strong case to be a believer and not an atheist. The atheism perspective becomes the least defensible.
Just real quick, just out of curiosity, what do you think of the Church of England's call that that they want to apologize to Charles Darwin? Do you think that was in order or not?
I'm sorry, there was a little glitch there. I didn't hear the end of the question.
Some people in the Church of England are talking about wanting to issue an apology to Charles Darwin, and that has been greeted both, enthusiastically and not enthusiastically. What's your take on that? This is really sort of off subject, just out of curiosity.
So, actually, I'm not quite sure what the historical evidence is that an apology is needed, because when Darwin's publication first came out 150 years ago, a lot of people in the church actually embraced that. Now, I don't know whether the Church of England as a whole was appalled and said terrible things that they now regret, but certainly if you look across the Christian church, there were many people who said, hooray, Darwin has figured out the answer to how. We knew why, but now we've got a little bit of an answer that we needed before to how. Praise the Lord. We understand God's creative activity in a new way. What's the problem? And in fact, the resistance to Darwin was probably less intense in the first couple of decades after the publication of The Origin of Species than it is today in many American evangelical circles, where Darwin is seen as such an evil force.
Right.
We've had a strange 150 years here, and people who've looked at that have marveled at the way in which, despite the evidence that Genesis now, on the basis of scientific data, should be considered as not an entirely literal description, that many Christian believers now adopt that view in ways that they didn't 200 years ago. We've kind of had this funny polarization going on, and admittedly that has had its flames fueled by atheists who are using evolution as a club over the head of believers in a way that's scientifically unjustified. And it's also fueled by fundamentalists who see evolution as threatening and dangerous, and therefore feel it necessary to say that science is not to be trusted. A very unfortunate situation, and totally unnecessary.
Right, so that actually kind of answers my next question, which was, do you think Christians have contributed to the current perception that faith is the enemy of science? And if so, what would you say? So you've already kind of answered that, but do you have any other words you give on that?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that the shrill extreme voices have occupied most of the attention for the last few years, that you don't hear a lot from people who actually find science to be reliable and trustworthy in an exciting way to discover how the universe is put together, and who also believe in a personal God. You do hear from atheists who are using science to try to make their case that we don't need God anymore, an argument which is fundamentally flawed. And you do hear from fundamentalists saying that the earth is only 6,000 years old, and if you don't believe it, go to the Creation Museum and we'll show you how. And you don't hear much at all from the mainstream of believers who tend to think there's a solution here but aren't quite sure what it is. And, this is not the core of Christianity, but it's getting in the way. When I talked to Tim Keller, the pastor at Redeemer in New York, a wonderful guy who's also written thoughtfully about this in his book, The Reason for God, he will tell you that skeptics who come into his church that he starts to talk to about Christianity, the first question they hit him with is, well, what about evolution? You guys are all opposed to that, so how can I possibly be a Christian if you aren't willing to accept the data that science has told us about evolution? Tim doesn't necessarily like having that conversation, but he has to. And he's come to the same conclusion I have, that namely evolution is not in any way contrary to God as the creator. It was a method by which God carried out this intention of ultimately resulting in creatures like us in God's image. And here we are, somehow fighting about how God did it.